This is RTE Radio 1. And now a series for Saturday evenings in Taoisigh, Leaders of the State. A series of programmes dealing with the 11 men who led Irish governments since the foundation of the state. The presenter is Andy O'Mahony.
John A. Costello was Taoisigh from 1948 to 1951. He was leader of the state's first inter-party government. He also led the second inter-party government from 1954 to 1957. Costello, a former Attorney General in the Cosgrave government, was a compromise choice in 1948 because the then leader of Fine Gael, Richard Mulcahy, was not acceptable as Taoisigh to Sean McBride, leader of Clonmacnoise, because Mulcahy had been commander of the Free State forces in the Civil War. The two most talked about controversies that dogged that first inter-party government were the mother and child crisis and that which surrounded the announcement by John A. Costello in Canada in September 1948 of the government's intention to declare a republic.
The decision to repeal the External Relations Act was taken by the government unanimously before I left for Canada to attend the meeting of the Canadian Bar Association.
On the occasion of his retirement from the Dáil in 1959, Mr. Costello recalled the circumstances in which the Republic of Ireland was declared.
What happened was that on one Sunday evening, I was in with the late Mr. John Hearn. He was then our ambassador in Canada, and I was in their embassy in Canada, and I was rung up by an editor of one of the Tory newspapers of Ottawa to say that the news had broken in the edition of the Sunday Independent that day, that the government intended to repeal the External Relations Act, and what had I to say about that? I, of course, said I wouldn't say anything at that time, but I had arranged long before I came to Canada that there should be on the following Tuesday a press conference in the Parliament House in Ottawa. And there were very large, there was to be, and in fact there was a very large collection of newspaper men from all over America, Canada, and as far away as Russia. And I knew that the first question that I would be asked when that press conference assembled was it true, what appeared in the Sunday Independent, that the government intended to repeal the External Relations Act? And I made up my mind after considering it. I was thousands of miles away from my colleagues. The responsibility fell upon me. I could have dodged the issue. I could have said no comment. I could have denied it. If I denied it, of course, it would have been a lie. If I said there would be no comment, it would have been clear that it meant saying yes, they had decided. So I made up my mind that, as I have the view I always have, that in all circumstances telling the truth is the best. And I decided I would tell the truth and all this.
This is RTE Radio 1. And now a series for Saturday evenings in Taoisigh, Leaders of the State. A series of programmes dealing with the 11 men who led Irish governments since the foundation of the state. The presenter is Andy O'Mahony.
John A. Costello was Taoisigh from 1948 to 1951. He was leader of the state's first inter-party government. He also led the second inter-party government from 1954 to 1957. Costello, a former Attorney General in the Cosgrave government, was a compromise choice in 1948 because the then leader of Fine Gael, Richard Mulcahy, was not acceptable as Taoisigh to Sean McBride, leader of Clonmacnoise, because Mulcahy had been commander of the Free State forces in the Civil War. The two most talked about controversies that dogged that first inter-party government were the mother and child crisis and that which surrounded the announcement by John A. Costello in Canada in September 1948 of the government's intention to declare a republic.
The decision to repeal the External Relations Act was taken by the government unanimously before I left for Canada to attend the meeting of the Canadian Bar Association.
On the occasion of his retirement from the Dáil in 1959, Mr. Costello recalled the circumstances in which the Republic of Ireland was declared.
What happened was that on one Sunday evening, I was in with the late Mr. John Hearn. He was then our ambassador in Canada, and I was in their embassy in Canada, and I was rung up by an editor of one of the Tory newspapers of Ottawa to say that it had been, the news had broken in the edition of the Sunday Independent that day, that the government intended to repeal the External Relations Act. And what had I to say about that? I, of course, said I wouldn't say anything at that time, but I had arranged long before I came to Canada that there should be on the following Tuesday a press conference in the Parliament House in Ottawa. And there were very large, there was to be, and in fact there was a very large collection of newspaper men from all over America, Canada, and as far away as Russia. And I knew that the first question that I would be asked when that press conference assembled was it true, what appeared in the Sunday Independent, that the government intended to repeal the External Relations Act? And I made up my mind after considering it. I was thousands of miles away from my colleagues. The responsibility fell upon me. I could have dodged the issue. I could have said no comment. I could have denied it. If I denied it, of course, it would have been a lie. If I said there would be no comment, it would have been clear that it meant saying yes, they had decided. So I made up my mind that, as I have, the view I always have, that in all circumstances, telling the truth is the best. And I decided I would tell the truth, and all I said was, in answer to the question that was put to me, as I knew it inevitably would be put to me, when I was asked was it the intention of the government to repeal the External Relations Act, and I said yes. Now that's the way I did not declare the Republic in Canada.
The response of the British government to the declaration of a republic was to strengthen their guarantees to the Ulster Unionists in the new Government of Ireland Act. O'Connell Street was thronged in May 1949 to hear all parties oppose that development.
The Irish nation at home and abroad is united on this issue. We have here on this platform and in this vast concourse of people every class and every creed, every section of the people. We have different parties, different political parties represented. We have as political parties our different aims, our different policies, our different methods of achieving what we all hope for the peace, the unity, and the advancement politically and economically of our country. But on this issue we are all united, and we speak here tonight with one voice. Whatever our political views are, whatever our personal differences in the past may have been, we stand here tonight, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour, and Republica, and the Saloon, Congress of Irish Union, Labour Party, the party from the north with Mr. McIntyre, Mr. Conlon, and Senator Lennon. We all stand together here tonight and speak with one voice.
The other major controversy that beset the first inter-party government was the mother and child scheme. Looking back in 1969, John A. Costello said that he didn't accept that the mother and child crisis showed the Republic to be a priest-ridden society.
I think the power of the Church at the present time is as powerful as ever it was, because it exists not through any authority that's exercised either by priests or by bishops or by hierarchy or anybody else, but because the Church exists in the hearts of the Irish people, and the priests, as the representatives of the Church, have still the strong place in affection and regard that they always had. And it's absurd to be talking about priest-ridden people. We're a priest-ridden people because we're a Catholic religious people, and for no other reason.
The voice of John A. Costello, who led the first inter-party government in the state from 1948 to 1951. He led a second inter-party government from 1954 to 1957. With me to assess his periods in office are the historians Ronan Fanning, David McCullough, Bernadette Whelan, John Horgan, and Tom Garvin. Was William Norton as opposed as Sean McBride was to Richard Mulcahy becoming Taoisigh? Tom Garvin.
I gather that he wasn't. He had a Republican streak in him. He came from a party and a tradition that was in many ways Republican, socialist Republican, I suppose you might call it. And you did have these odd sympathies and connections across the different party divides. After all, even Mulcahy used to say, of all people, used to say, we got fed up being outgreened by Fianna Fáil. That's one of his rationalisation for declaring a republic, which he wasn't an active pusher of a republic, but he certainly acquiesced and went along with it because he thought it might end the whole controversy, Free State versus Republic, finally, at least as far as the 26 counties was concerned.
So you're saying Norton wasn't opposed to
I gather he wasn't.
to Mackay. Bernadette to Whelan?
I think I agree with Tom there. I think he certainly didn't have, it's from the same point of view, I don't think that he had the same difficulty at all that others had.
That Sean McBride had.
That Sean McBride had at all.
Dave?
Well, I think it's significant that it was Norton that actually raised the question of Mulcahy not being Taoisigh, and he may well have been doing that simply as a tactful way of raising the question so that McBride wouldn't have to come in heavy on it. And he said, I think, at an initial meeting of party leaders, quite tactfully, that some of the other parties wouldn't really like the leader of Fine Gael, the leader of another party, to be Taoisigh because it could be seen as favouritism or something like that. So without actually saying that the reason we won't have you is because of your record in the Civil War, he was able to gloss over it in that way. And Mulcahy was very quick to say, well, if I'm standing in the way of forming a government and putting Fianna Fáil out of power, I'll stand aside quite happily.
How compromised was Costello by the nature of his election?
Well, he didn't have the powers that another Taoisigh would have. He didn't have any role in selecting the ministers that were in his cabinet.
The leaders of the party chose the ministers.
Yeah, and in Labour's case, they elected them. When it came to disciplining ministers, most particularly in the Brown case, it wasn't him that demanded Brown's resignation, it was McBride's. He didn't have the power of patronage that the Taoisigh would normally have in terms of the 11 members of the Seanad. They were divvied out among the parties again. So from that point of view, he could be seen as being in a weaker position than other Taoisigh may have been. But in some ways, maybe that wasn't such a disadvantage. He had to keep all these parties together. He had to keep them all on side, and he had to do that by a process of conciliation of all of the different interests rather than putting...
And he was well cut out for that, was he, Ronan? That kind of conciliation style?
I'm not sure that he was. I think those... I think those extracts we've just listened to, I think he was a choleric man. I only saw him speak once. And he was replying to an auditor's address. It was when I was in college, and there was an auditor was reading a paper of the society, and he turned on him and rendered him quite gratuitously. Yeah. I've forgotten what it was that the auditor had said that gave offence. Yeah. But I must say I found the broadcast Sunday, talking about the Sunday Independent and what he was going to do on Tuesday. I mean, the telephones were fairly well developed by that stage. There's no reason whatever why
the character of the man. Did you see him, John Horgan, as impetuous as...
I would certainly underwrite what Ronan had said about my feeling of him being a bit peppery.
Yeah.
And it helps to explain one of the great things that people have been kicking around a bit. Did he or did he not threaten to resign when he came back from Canada? And there was this unminuted meeting out of the House and all, did he or didn't he, sort of thing. From what I've been able to gather of that particular sets of circumstances, it is quite possible that he, in his peppery frame of mind, said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, there's no point in going on with this, is there?" You know. Yeah. And it suited Brown very much to take this up as a solemn declaration, whereas everybody else who had worked with him over a long number of years and who had indeed probably attended far more cabinet meetings with him than Brown had, were inclined to say, "Oh well, there's your man off again. Yeah, we'll see if he writes it down anyway."
And I think Smiley of the Irish Times was in the Brown camp on that, wasn't he, Dave?
Well, Smiley was very put out at the Declaration of the Republic, and Costello in later years always blamed him for launching a campaign to drive Costello out of politics, and that's why Smiley and Brown were at one on the mother and child scheme, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm. There was the British ambassador, of course, who was frequently whinging to London about Costello's uncalled for and unhelpful remarks about partition. Mm-hmm. And from that point of view, I mean, you couldn't drive a nail between himself and De Valera in relation to some of the sentiments that he expressed, and indeed some of the language he used to express them.
Yeah. That cabinet, that first cabinet meeting that sent a telegram to the Vatican about, assuring filial loyalty and devotion to the Pope. Just having listened to John A. Costello, they're now talking about priesthood and society. Of course, it was a different era, Tom Garvin. It was
an era in which people were literally believing Catholics, where it was quite common for men and women to have priests as confessors and also as advisors on moral issues generally, and even on career choices, in a way that now is almost unimaginable.
This was the first meeting, the first cabinet, John, first meeting.
It was.
Yeah,
yes.
You find that unusual? Or?
I find it terribly difficult to think myself back into that. But then again,
Yeah.
I was a member of a parliamentary delegation to Rome in 1973 when I was in the Senate. And the then leader of that delegation, Liam Cosgrave, swore the undying loyalty of the Irish people to the Holy Father in his private audience, without exception. Mind you, there might have been some people in the Northeast who would have a word or two to say about that.
Yes.
But I mean, so you're talking about a spectrum that goes from the Costello time at least up to the early 70s.
So they were all there. Even Noel Brown would have been part of that
He would.
assent, that assuring of filial loyalty and so on. Yes.
Yes, and indeed, when you look at what Costello said in the Dáil on the occasion on the debate on Noel Brown's resignation, and you look at the other stuff, the McQuaid papers, very carefully, there wasn't really a great deal of difference between what the two of them were saying about their attitude to the Catholic Church.
I think it was an extraordinarily crow-thumping cabinet by any standard.
Yeah.
And
Even allowing for the time.
even allowing for the times. I mean, there were occasions when De Valera and Fianna Fáil, if you take, say, an episode like the Spanish Civil War, when Fianna Fáil and De Valera came under enormous pressure from the Independent and from the bishops, saying support for Franco, there's only one right side. And he just said no. He wouldn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
And there are other instances. But, I mean, the papers to which John Horgan referred, I remember reading those in the archives, in the diocesan archives, the exchanges between government ministers and the Archbishop. And I came away from that with a very, very bad taste.
But it was of the time.
No, but it
surely.
wasn't. No, I mean, I thought, not McQuaid. I didn't have anything to do. I mean, McQuaid, it seemed to me, was given an opportunity here, and he was going to play his hand as well he might, for which you cannot blame him.
Yeah. How close was Johnny Costello to John Charles McQuaid? Good friends?
Well, certainly Dr. McQuaid seemed to have a great deal of access to the Taoisigh as and when he wanted it, and certainly any suggestions he was to make seemed to be taken up in full. Noel Brown wrote in his autobiography about how shocked he was when he sought an interview with Dr. McQuaid, and he was summoned to the Archbishop's palace for this interview to take place, and he was of the view that a government minister should meet the Archbishop in the government minister's department rather than the other way around. But it was...
Yeah.
They were different times.
He does.
Bernadette,
he does
Whelan.
at least attempt. I mean, I think the other sort of person that forms the axis in that sort of McQuaid-Costello relationship is Joe Walsh out in Rome, who's the ambassador, and who is, of course, a very good and close friend to Costello, and is godfather to one of his children. And so there's this very tight relationship between the two of them. And of course, even the sort of conduit for the fundraising that 60,000 that's collected at the church gates and then sent off to the Italian Christian Party is the Department of External Affairs. And it goes through, and the government has agreed to that. And so, I mean, from the very beginning, there is this close relationship.
But it was a tight race, Fianna Fáil playing the same game. I mean, it was...
There's a kind
It's
of...
really common for prime ministers to go to the bishop rather than the bishop to go to the prime minister. Going back to the time of the Free State, and certainly De Valera, when he had his own incipient mother and child crisis in 1952,
he went to Armagh.
Went to Armagh immediately, post haste.
This new government getting off the ground, there was agreement on 10 major areas of action, which was published. But Fine Gael wanted to reduce taxes, so that looked like an impossible combination, David.
It did look like an impossible combination, but they managed to do it thanks to the largesse of the US government, largely with the Marshall Plan. Yeah. And that allowed them to, it was very fortunate that money suddenly became available, because otherwise the government wouldn't have lasted. Because when they had that money available and they borrowed money they issued, they doubled the size of the national debt in the course of the 3 years. They were able to keep everybody happy. Paddy McGilligan was able to take 6 pence off the income tax. They were able to increase social welfare. They were able to spend money on land reclamation and so on. So the money from the Marshall Aid and the other money they borrowed was absolutely crucial to square that circle.
They also used the sweepstakes money to finance the hospital building and all that sort of thing. And some of the cuts in taxes look rather odd to modernise, I think. Tobacco and alcohol, for example, were the poor man's luxuries or staples, whatever you want to call them, and that was supported not only by Fine Gael but also by Labour.
Staying with the Marshall Plan, Bernadette, by which you've written a book, it was set up under De Valera before the Costello government came in, McBride largely looking after it. There was opposition from finance, was there? I mean, Ken Whittaker's name is often mentioned as somebody who wasn't in favour of the idea.
Well, Whittaker was a junior official in finance, as Ronan has written about previously. But the major opponent really was McCullough. And, from the very beginning they opposed it. They did not want the money. They didn't
Why not?
want the money.
Was it the way it would be spent? Was that
the notion that it would increase state expenditure and government spending, and that was a major worry. And of course that would lead to inflation, which was of course their bugbear right throughout the period and into the 50s. And then secondly, the issue that it would force less of a reliance on Britain. And of course there were strong supporters of sterling and of the link with sterling.
Were there any strings attached in getting this aid, accepting it?
The expectation was that the majority of the aid would be in grant form, and of course it came through largely in loan form, which had to be repaid, and that was not expected. And also the amount we received in total, about 46 million. MacBride at one stage was throwing figures around that we were going to get 140 million. So it was less than we expected, but as Dave said, the essential factor was that it coincided with the arrival of a new government with all these plans, these spending plans, and that was the important thing. And then, of course, as you say, as Tom said, in finance, then you had the sweepstake.
I think one of the things about martial aid, the point about finance, it's the first occasion when the Department of External Affairs really flexes its muscles, thanks to McBride, in an economic, financial area, and I think that's I think it's very important for that reason.
If we broaden it out on the economic frontier, you had a Department of Finance set against further spending. I mean, talking more generally. On the other hand, you had Keynesian type advisors like Paddy Lynch and Patrick McGilligan, whom were told Lynch influenced. So how did that work out, that kind of tension?
Well, I think the other key person there was Alexis Fitzgerald as well.
Yes, he was also an advisor.
Who's involved. And the fact that, from the beginning, Costello admitted that he didn't know a lot about economics. And in both governments, so he immediately drafts in Lynch. And of course, the important thing there is that he's able then to bypass finance in a sense. He's able to get advice from his own man. And I think that it was important from the beginning for him. And then, he himself, as McGilligan, had been part of government in the 1920s that had funded the Shannon scheme. So state investment was not an alien notion to them at all.
I think Paddy Lynch once said to me that one of the ways in which McGilligan helped hold that cabinet together, he was valetudinarian. There were always worries about his health. But he would often, when there were critical issues coming up to the cabinet, he would stay at home in bed. He just wouldn't turn up. The issue would be taken, there would be a phone call placed, and he would say something over the telephone. And he seems, on a couple of occasions, to have diffused potential crisis by this kind of masterly absence rather than...
I'm thinking a leaf out of Cosgrave's book in the case of the mutiny.
Yes.
What about the exclusion of Maurice Moynihan from the cabinet at the behest of Sean McBride? That must have been awkward for John A. Costello.
Well, it was, because you had the Taoisigh effectively trying to take minutes of the discussion.
Liam Cosgrave came in, the young Liam Cosgrave.
If he wasn't around, Costello had to do it himself, and then either Cosgrave or Costello would have to deliver the notes to Moynihan, and he'd get them typed up and processed and everything. It was absolute madness.
It was an extraordinarily inept government, I think.
Badly run.
Just badly managed. Extraordinarily inept. And the Moynihan thing is one evidence of it. And the other evidence is, whatever about the rights and wrongs of the Republic of Ireland Act, to decide to make that announcement in Canada, and also to take the British by surprise. This is one thing De Valera never ever did. If you're a small state, you're dealing with a big state, you're going to do something.
Am I right in thinking one of the cabitate decision was not recorded?
There is no record of any cabinet decision.
Jolie makes the amusing point that at least the declaration of the Republic in Canada had the effect of obscuring his other commitment, which was to offer Irish aid to Canada if it were ever attacked by a communist power.
Which is great.
But that level of incompetence that Ronan talks about, it was well intentioned. Certainly, the place was slathered with good intentions, but it does reflect a cultural thing of the time, that so many of them, as opposed to the people they had just displaced, were part-time politicians. There was the bar library. Politics was an adjunct, really, to a much fuller life that was going on somewhere else. And that was why they thought they could do this business when they came into government, of keeping Moynihan out and doing it all themselves.
It's fairly evident that John A. Costello was pushed into the Taoisigh-ship. I'm going to miss the Bar Library, I'm going to miss my golf, I'm going to miss all the things that make my life. He was the reluctant Taoisigh.
And a great deal of money, too.
A great deal of money as well. And the contrast between him and Eamon de Valera, who loved power and mourned power when it was taken away from him, is quite extraordinary, quite stark.
But how did he do that? I mean, do you think...
I think he did extraordinarily well, because the first government did, after all, last 3.5 years. And I suppose Ronan has a point that it's like the dog walking on two legs. It's amazing he does it at all. And I do take that point. But it is an interesting government because an awful lot of things start at that point. The IDEA starts at that point.
1949, isn't it?
Yes, the CTT, the Republic itself. The beginnings of worry about the whole protection apparatus that had been built up in the 30s and the 40s. McGilligan writing notes and memos about our GNP falling behind other people. The beginnings of sensitivity to the fact that even defeated Germany and Austria were beginning to forge ahead. And here we were wandering around in the doldrums of the early 1950s. And the beginnings of honest debate as to whether or not Ireland as an independent country was not a disaster and a mistake.
I think that's a very important point, and I think McBride is important in that as a catalyst. He was very wrong-headed, I think, on most of the things he did, but as a catalyst, as an agent for changed attitudes, he is different. There are two things I'd add to Thomas on the list. One is Europe. You begin partly the martial aid thing, and partly because McBride, who spoke very fluent French, was such a Europhobe. And you begin to get sort of real interest in Europe. It dies down then from 51 until after the publication of Economic Development. The other thing is, whatever the rights and wrongs of Brown's, and I certainly don't buy all Noel Brown's arguments in his autobiography, there is a real change there, is that relations between church and state can never be the same again after the mother and child, because it's the first time it's been dragged out into the open. That's a change, and that's a very important change.
Would you agree with that, John Horgan?
I would indeed. Sometimes, anybody who writes history likes to think, what if, what might have been. And given what we know about Costello, not least the fact that he was socially in many ways quite progressive, maybe a rather paternalistic way, but it's said that he served on the boards of public hospitals. He had this kind of gut feeling for people in need. Given that, and given also the fact that that there was a need to do something in the country at the time, would Noel Brown have got more out of the church if he had had Costello with him than De Valera did with the bishops?
At what point did Costello get tough, begin to change his mind?
I think I think he was very much outside the loop. He assumed, and this may have something to do with his relationship with McBride, and I don't know how good or bad, or it became perhaps tenuous because McBride was away so much. But he thought McBride had a grip of things, and I think he only came into the scene when he realised that McBride didn't have a grip on things anymore, and by then, really, it was too late.
You're back then into Dave's point at the beginning, which was the modus operandi of the government, that effectively because each of the party leaders was in charge of
independent fiefdoms, if you like.
Indeed, and he was in charge of what was happening with health and with Brown in health and with the relationship there. It meant that Costello left it to McBride to handle. And then effectively comes in too late on it.
Because the relationship between McBride and Brown is broken down.
Sorry, Tom Garvin.
Don't exaggerate the possible weakness or the decentralised character of the government. De Valera's governments actually were rather similar behind closed doors, so to speak, but they did keep their disagreements behind closed doors, which I think was a more profound contrast. In other words, it was all happening in the open in 1948 to 1951. To more or less Glas Ronan's point, all of a sudden you watched Irish government out of doors and in the open.
In your book, David McCullough, you make the point, quote John Costello, saying he relied a lot on Norton.
This is what he said, that Norton, and it was interesting because it came up in a libel case that Norton took against the Irish press. The Irish press had written a story based on notes supplied by Sean Lemass, had written that Norton was doing very little in his own department, social welfare. He was spending most of his time looking after party interests. And Lemass had to have his day in the High Court, and he said what he'd meant was that Norton had been working at holding the government together, which you could say was a legitimate part of his job as Taoisigh. And I think that brings out the point that Norton was a kind of a fixer who also helped to keep the parties together.
We mustn't forget James Dillon. I'm picking up different views as to how well James Dillon did in agriculture, Tom Garvin.
He certainly was noticeable. He said he would drown Britain in eggs and all the rest of it. They did clear 2.5 million acres, according to himself, of stones in west of Ireland, and he did inherit a pretty disastrous situation where wheat growing and general abuse of the land, apparently during the war and afterwards, had more or less starved the soil. So they had to look around for fertilizers and all kinds of renewal schemes and all the rest of it. And they also had the American agricultural experts breathing down their necks. And he seemed to have coped fairly well.
Your impression of Dylan, Ronan Fanning, how well he did?
I think it is difficult. He was certainly a larger-than-life character. There's a wonderful correspondence between him and McGilligan's Secretary of Finance, in which they abuse each other, but in very elegant terms.
Yeah.
And I think he was very pro-American, Dylan. It comes out of Morris Manning's excellent biography.
Yeah.
And I think that was an important point at the time. In fact, there's a pro-American streak in this government. I think one of the things...
And McBride was quite pro-American, yeah?
He was. But I think one of the things about this government is... Costello, for example, talking about McBride and the situation in 48-51, Costello wanted McBride to be Minister for External Affairs again in 54-57. McBride decided to stay outside. It didn't happen. He virtually offered him the same job back. Now, when he didn't take it, and when Cosgrave, who had been his parliamentary secretary and was obviously a relatively junior member of Fine Gael at the time, went into External Affairs, it's now clear that a lot of the foreign policy in 54-57 was created by Costello, especially the pro-American dimension in the second principle at the United Nations. That is actually pure Costello, straight out of a Costello memorandum. So you're faced with the dilemma there that on the one hand, Costello's foreign policy, which was very much more, we are part of the Christian democratic European world, we're against the communists, we're part of the Christian body of nations, all this kind of thing, was very different from the line that McBride was pursuing. But nevertheless, he offers McBride the job, because foreign policy isn't that important. What's really important is trying to hold the government in power.
Together. John Garvin.
There are two decisions that are rather between them, a kind of rhinoceros in the corner of the drawing room. Nobody talks about them. And that was the abolition of the road system, the cancellation of the road programme, I think 1948, in favour of building houses. We're still looking at the road system of 1948 by and large. And secondly, the transatlantic airline was cancelled after they had bought 5 Lockheed Constellations. Yeah. They were handed the 6 freedoms, the set down and pick up rights within the United States. The Americans are so eager to get into Europe. They were going to give Ireland all kinds of privileges within the United States, privileges which Aer Lingus has never got back. Yeah. And then they threw them away at the beginning of the post-war air travel boom.
What about the 10-point programme? What happened to William Norton's welfare reform programme?
William Norton was trying to bring in a comprehensive social welfare scheme and failed. The government basically ran out of time. In fairness to him, you'd have to say that he did quite well under the circumstances, because every time he brought a submission to government, he was snowed under with objections, because every department would say, oh yes, comprehensive social welfare scheme, very good idea, but of course it can't apply to the soldiers under the Department of Defence, or can't apply to the Gardaí under the Department of Justice, or local authority workers and so on. So very much a failure on the part of Norton not to get it through. Had the government lasted a little bit longer, possibly he would have.
I think there's an interesting pointer to Norton's role in that after the election, when there was still a bit of doubt as to what was going to happen, Michael French O'Carroll was specifically called to a meeting with Norton and Costello in Costello's house, to see whether or not he could be made to support the outgoing administration on foot of an improved social welfare provision. He wasn't offered a ministry, as was casually said about him by his being friends, but Norton was obviously, even at that late stage, still a pivotal figure in trying to hold the thing together.
And Fine Gael did well in 51, meaning what?
They gained 10 seats. They went from 19.8% of the vote, which
and how do you read that?
To 25.
How do you read that?
I think a lot of it actually was, strange enough, seemed to be attributed to Dylan, because they did quite well in rural areas, and even though Dylan wasn't in Fine Gael at the time, they still seemed to get the credit for it. And also they benefited from inter-party transfers. They were very important in getting a number of seats, winning a number of seats. Yeah.
What you say, Bernadette?
In Cork.
Cork, yes.
Clan Republic candidates that were losing their seats left, right and centre were transferring to Fine Gael.
Ronan Fanning, who do you think John A. Costello was most wary of would have been watching, or did he get on with them all then?
I think even De Valera.
Touche.
I think there's a real sense in which...
It's said that people are more fearful of those within the ranks than those outside.
Well, I think in this case it's very hard to know what the ranks are. I mean, Dave McCullough made a point about, and it can't be emphasised enough, the fact that all the other ministers were in place and had their portfolios assigned before the Taoisigh was appointed.
Yeah.
It was quite extraordinary. I mean, there's a very poignant piece of paper in the McGilligan papers where they're all listed. You can see,
Sure.
it's handwritten, and against each department there's a name been penciled in, except for Taoisigh.
Tom Garvin, anybody who annoyed him, who got on his nerves, would you say?
Well, I suppose Noel Brown in the end. But then, of course, Brown annoyed everybody by the end of that government. He used to shout at civil servants a lot. Various senior civil servants I have known over the years and talked to always remember him shouting down the phone, not bullyingly, but just noisily.
John A.
Yes.
You mean like he did there on those speeches?
We'll have no racetracks for plutocrats, or the church doesn't want it, the church won't get it, this kind of stuff.
They say the office makes the man, and you say John A. was reluctant, did it in his case, that's what it did.
He was irritated a bit by everybody because he was in a way a politician by not so much accident.
Any difference in 54, 57? Anything to add to 48, 51?
I think the foreign policy thing is quite interesting, but apart from that, I think it's a much less interesting government, 54,
What about the
57.
finance end, Ronan? Because it's said that he didn't get on particularly well, not in personal terms, but in economic policy terms with Sweetman. And yet he'd appointed Sweetman into finance. And his views were much more demotic than Sweetman's in a sense. And if he had been stronger in keeping Sweetman in his box, would that government have done better at the end of the day?
That's why McBride pulled out, wasn't it? Because of, partly because of Sweetman's policies, yeah?
It was, but there was also a Republican...
the IRA. You were seeing Costello as too aggressive towards the IRA.
The other important aspect, I think, is how the Fine Gael, or the second inter-party government, are in a sense forced to reassess the economic issues heading into late 1956 as a result of McBride, and they come up with this new 10-point plan, which includes in it the establishment of a capital advisory investment committee, which is so important then and underpins subsequent foreign investment and investment within Ireland as well, and encouraging of foreign investment. And I think that was a key issue in terms of what we were saying earlier.
Are you saying the way was paid for the great Lemass-Whittaker takeoff?
Yeah, partly.
For economic development, yes, I'd agree with that.
I think that we'll go back to again this issue that while neither government might not have made a major impact in terms of improving economic standards and working conditions, that at the same time this infrastructure is laid for later developments, for post-58, post-economic development. I think the Capital Advisory Committee...
Who was largely responsible for that?
Well, it was largely Whittaker Finance. I'd agree with what Bernadette says on that. I mean, Whittaker, for example, to pick up the question that John Horgan asked me, Whittaker was impressed by Sweetman. He felt he didn't have enough time, but that he was young, he was energetic, he was a different generation, he'd be the same generation as Alexis Fitzgerald. He could think in much more inventive and imaginative ways. And he gives Sweetman a lot of credit for the Capital Investment Advisory Committee and for preparing the ground which eventually leads to economic
So this
development.
is much more of a continuum than we've been led to think. I mean, it's much more of a case of the ground being well prepared, Bernadette.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the issues about both governments is that now the sort of infrastructure, the problems in the Irish economy are now being faced, are now being offered out into public through people like McBride, who had his finger into every pie in 48-51 because of the nature of his control over the Marshall Plan. And then subsequently, because you have within the second inter-party government, they have to face, again, they come in under such dire economic circumstances. And they have to try and come, and then they face things like the Commission of Immigration report that comes out, the 1956 census that comes out, that tells them that we're the highest level ever of immigration, 50-odd thousand.
But on the other hand, Costello had a less complicated balancing act, David.
He did, but he still had Sean McBride outside the government, and he needed to keep
outside the tent. Yeah.
Outside the tent, where he proved to be more dangerous than he had been inside the tent. And Bernadette mentioned the new economic deal that was put together to keep McBride happy, and Costello in interviews later was very sore about the fact that shortly afterwards McBride pulled the plug anyway, because he was under pressure to do so, apparently, from Republican elements, because they weren't happy about the line that was being taken with the border campaign.
It's an odd, unstable period as far as parties are concerned, and that's one of the reasons why I think we find it hard to assess it, and we've always found it hard to assess it. But there is one of these other unspoken of consequences of 1948. You don't end up with two Labour parties anymore. One on the Fianna Fáil side and one on the anti-Fianna Fáil side, which could easily have happened had Everett taken some deal from De Valera and Company in 1948. He only just barely didn't, apparently.
Yes, the instability, I think, is key. I mean, if you take 48 to 57, a period of 9 years, you have 4 changes of government.
Yes.
You have only 1 change of government in 1932 in the previous, 22 to 48.
Yeah.
And then from 57, Fianna Fáil are in again for another 13 years.
Yes.
So there is an instability, and I think politicians on all sides, and I think the elites, the civil servants, even the bishops, are learning to come to terms with what you might describe as the politics of economics. And politics isn't about sovereignty and independence and Anglo-Irish relations. But there's a real world out there, and they better get to grips.
You could also think of it as the intervention of the electorate. It actually moves in and changes the government by not voting in sufficient numbers for Fianna Fáil. In effect, the beast of a million heads is saying, we're fed up with Fianna Fáil. Now, you guys have a go, and we'll vote against you again in a few years' time.
So I suppose would we underrate, David, the fact that it worked at all, especially 48 to 51?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what everyone says about Costello, he did a superb job in keeping that government together. I mean, even Noel Brown commented on what a fair chairman he was of government meetings, and for Noel Brown to give praise to anybody who was in that government is pretty impressive.
How will Costello be judged? I mean,
I think he'd be judged in those terms as the hour called for the man, and the man was there. He was possibly the only one who could have held that government together. Certainly under Mulcahy, it would have been disastrous, wouldn't have lasted a week. I think everybody right from the start was very keen to have him as Taoisigh, because he had a very close relationship with McBride through the law library. He helped to persuade McBride to take up democratic politics, and he had a close relationship with the Labour Party. So he was able to take all those elements and keep them together.
And you would say presumably his contribution to foreign policy in the second session.
I wouldn't agree with David McCullough on this. I mean, I don't think history is going to judge Costello kindly, at least for some significant time to come. I think if you take 2 episodes, the Declaration of the Republic, which led to the Ireland Act, which deepened partition, and one could argue that that kind of speech that we heard him making in O'Connell Street was the kind of speech which created or helped to make possible the IRA. And the other point is, I think he'll be identified with that, and he'll be identified with the mother and child thing, and that means deference to the church. And I think for those 2 reasons,
how fair is that?
He's unlikely to
Garvin?
get a good press for some time.
Not sure. I think I agree with David on balance. I think the sins of omission of that government are really more important than the sins of commission.
And what were those?
Well, the Atlantic airline, for one, certainly the road programme for 2, and thirdly, education. They put Mulcahy into education, and when he's setting up a council of education a year later, he bemoans the evil that human knowledge has reaped on the continent of Europe in the 20th century. I mean, that may be true that human knowledge has done terrible things, but it's not for a Minister of Education to say it.
I think that
John Horgan.
Insofar as it was possible for him to grow into the job, he did grow into it over a period of time. And even though I was joking a little while ago about him turning his back on the large salaries, the large fees that were available at the bar and all the rest of it, I think it's important to remember at the end of the day that he did turn his back on them. You know, and public service, when public service called, he may have grumbled a bit, but he did it.
He did it, yes.
Yeah.
And in relation to his, I take Tom's point absolutely about the nature of church-state relationships changing, but there's something also very interesting and very Irish about the story that Paddy Lynch tells when McQuaid phoned him to complain about something just at the conclusion of the debate on Noel Brown's resignation. Paddy Lynch went into his office to explain that the Archbishop had been on the phone complaining about the Irish News Agency. And Costello, for all his filial loyalty and piety, put his head in his hands and said, "Oh God, not that too." And he wasn't talking, I think, about the Irish News Agency.
We've been discussing John A. Costello, who was Taoisigh between 1948 and 1951, and from 1954 to 1957. My thanks to Tom Garvin, Bernadette Whelan, Ronan Fanning, David McCullough and John Horgan. Next week, the leadership of Sean Lemass. Till then, bye-bye.
And that was the third of 11 programmes on the Taoisigh, leaders of the state, dealing with the individuals who led Irish governments since the foundation of the state. The presenter is Andy O'Mahony. The series producer is Michael Campion.